Right, hello everyone. So today I would like to talk about a book called Patriarcha by an author named Robert Filmer. This is a very, very important philosophical book written in the English language, an important piece of English political history, but nonetheless not a book that's very well read, to be honest with you. I don't think Penguin does it. I don't think a lot of the mainstream publishers actually published this book. The version of it that I got was from some academic publisher. And you also don't see many people talking about it on YouTube or what have you. But nonetheless, a very influential book, because this is one of the two books that John Locke himself was responding to when he wrote his two treatises of government in 1689. Now, John Locke, as I'm sure you are aware, is essentially the founding father of modern day libertarianism, or the founding father of classical liberalism, or the founding father of world democracy, really. We live in the age of Wilsonian idealism. This is a point which I keep making again and again and again, but because most people seem to be unaware of it. But there was a president of America. His name was Woodrow Wilson. He's the guy that created the Fed in 1913, and he had a dream. He had a great dream, a vision for the world. He wanted the whole world essentially to be like America, be an American republic. And this is why he created the League of Nations. And of course the League of Nations failed, but after the Second World War the United Nations appeared, and now we have all these different international organizations, and communism has collapsed, and obviously the British Empire has gone and the French Empire has gone, and democracy is considered to be the norm. This is why in the 90s they said it's the end of history after the fall of the Soviet Union. Like, this is it, this is the conclusion, we've done it, we've cracked it. So what was Woodrow Wilson's plan? Essentially, he's giving John Locke's theory of government to the world, the social contract to the world, okay, representative democracy to the world. So, and a lot of people just don't seem to, I keep banging on about this point because a lot of people just don't seem to realize that is what has happened. They don't seem to realize that we actually do live in the New World Order already, because Woodrow Wilson was the guy that first spoke about the New World Order. This is why I keep returning to this point. But anyway, nonetheless, John Locke, 100%, got to be the most influential political philosopher of the last 500 years. I don't think anybody could question that. And his book, Two Treatises of Government, is thus the most important and influential political book of the last 500 years. And what was that book all about? Well, it was a response to Robert Filmer and to Thomas Hobbes. And yet today nobody really knows who Robert Filmer is. So people know who Thomas Hobbes is. Thomas Hobbes, of course, is the guy that wrote Leviathan. I'm always deeply tempted to call it The Leviathan, but it's only called Leviathan. It just feels awkward to come off the tongue every time I say it. But Hobbes wrote Leviathan, and he wrote it very much in reaction to the English Civil War. He famously said, life is nasty. Life without a king, or life in a state of nature, is nasty, brutish, and short. Therefore, we should come together and we should follow a king. And this idea was the idea of the social contract. So the idea he presented is that the people themselves have sovereignty, and the people themselves give that sovereignty away to a king to rule over them. Right? And what I mean by that is they essentially they're giving the king the power to pass judgment, the power to of life and death, because that's what it all comes down to at the end of the day. Martial power. Politics always comes down the barrel of a gun. So his argument was that the people themselves have the sovereignty, they have the freedom, that everyone's born with inalienable rights. He didn't use that term, that came later with the American Constitution, but that's the point he was getting at. You have your own personal control of yourself, and you give that to a king, because a king will put an end to the state of nature. What is the state of nature? It's a state of anarchy. It's the state of the English Civil War. It's the state of a country that doesn't have a king, and everybody's killing everybody else. There's no law and order. It's just chaos, and everything's a bit rubbish. So his argument is you need somebody in charge to stop the chaos so that people can have peace and prosperity. And so it is worth the sacrifice of giving your sovereignty to the king for this. So this all sounds very normal and straightforward. He's not the first guy to present the idea of the social contract, but probably he's the most famous. Sounds all very normal and straightforward to us, but there were other opinions at the time, because Hobbes wrote Leviathan in 1650 or something like this, right? I think he actually educated King Charles II while he was in exile or hiding in France. I may be wrong about that though, but he wrote the book after the English Civil War, roughly 1650, something like this. But at that time, there are other people who are advocating for an absolute monarchy. King James is one of them. Actually, Robert Filmer in the Patriarcha quotes King James quite a bit. Obviously, King James is our Scottish king, right? So after Elizabeth died, she didn't have any children. Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen. The Virgin Queen Elizabeth died, didn't have any children. We got King James down from Scotland, and he had this notion of absolute monarchy that he brought with him, and obviously he raised his son with a similar opinion, which is why Charles I shut down Parliament, which is what kicked off the English Civil War. People forget all this. People forget this, but we fought a civil war for Parliament. But what was it really about? It was about taxation. Because Charles wanted to tax the English people, the British people, without representation within Parliament, essentially. And the British people didn't want it. This is what Parliament has always been about. It's always been... Robert Filmer doesn't make any of these points, by the way. But this is what Parliament's always been about. It's always been about lords and the people in general trying to stop themselves from being tax raped by the king. Now, of course, Parliament is a tyranny that does tax you in order to pay for a massive bureaucracy. I guess the bureaucracy has stepped in the place of the king. That's what we've got now. We do have a king, but he's like a little slug who's powerless and he has no voice, and he's just like in the corner. And instead we don't have mob rule, we have bureaucratic mob rule. We have the rule of the parasitical bureaucratic class that just sucks tax revenue of the British public, so they can sit around essentially just doing nothing, just living a life of luxury. I've seen Rupert Lowe the other day complaining about there's some like in the civil service, there's some position pays £50,000 a year. It's like a diversity and inclusion management system. Like literally a position for a guy or a girl probably to sit around and talk about diversity for 50 grand a year. Okay, who's paying for that? We're paying for that through taxes. And yet most people seem fine with the taxation because the population's been so monumentally dumbed down. Again, another complaint I have again and again and again. The budget. Nobody's got their eyes on the numbers. We had a budget a month ago or whatever. There were a lot of complaints about the farmers and this, that and the other. But you go online, you look, like where's the Daily Mail budget breakdown? I mean, you might find something, but you won't find a detailed, clear explanation of what is being spent on which departments and the details. And like, I can't find a website. If anybody knows of a really good website which just really gets into the nitty gritty of the budget, please show me. But I can't find it, and it does feel like journalists are just not paying attention. They haven't got their eyes on the ball. But the beating heart of British politics has always been the economy. And really, when I say economy, it's taxation. That's what democracy is in our country. Historically, that's what it's been about. It's been about people saying, stop tax raping us, please, my dear king. But anyway, a little bit of a tangent. The point being, Hobbes wrote this book. He established the idea of the social contract. it was this idea, we kind of take it for granted now, but it was pretty new for its time, because at that time you had, as I say, King James believed in the idea of the absolute monarchy, and then you have theories about serfdom, theories about the king is essentially owns England, like we're essentially living on his estate, like he's the lord of the manor, and nobody can actually own their land. Everybody is just in a roundabout way living on the king's land, and so therefore we must do what he tells us to do because we're his subjects, and that's it, right? So it's not a social contract. We don't agree to be ruled over by the king. We're just born in his kingdom, and we belong to him, basically. So that's the kind of medieval conception. Whether we're talking about serfdom or even just lords and ladies or people living in the towns, so the idea was like you basically belong to the king. That's it. So Hobbes's conception of a social contract at his time is quite revolutionary. His conclusion obviously was to have a king, to end the state of nature. Locke took the idea of the social contract and said, actually, we don't really need a king. What we need is a democracy, because he thought the state of nature is not really that bad, and so you don't want to run the risk of being ruled over by a tyrant. So if you're going to give your sovereignty to a government, then you should have some representation within that government. That was his spin on things, and that became essentially the dominant force. Well, at least not in this country, actually, because obviously we ended up with a constitutional monarchy. But worldwide, with the spread of Wilsonian idealism in the 20th century, this has become the dominant idea, the Republican idea, you see. So, point being, my dear friends, what I'm trying to say is Robert Filmer's Patriarcha is a very important book that basically nobody's heard of, because when John Locke wrote the two treatises of government, he was responding to Hobbes and he was responding to Robert Filmer. So all that being said, what's this book all about? Well, it's called the Patriarcha, and essentially it was actually, funny enough, the Wikipedia page says it was first written even before the English Civil War, but it didn't end up getting published until 1680. It's about 9 years before Locke published his book, and certainly after Hobbes. So Hobbes is not actually mentioned in the book, because I think it was written before the Leviathan. I did it just then. The Leviathan. It was written before Leviathan was written. But Filmer famously in other places has commented on Hobbes's Leviathan and the idea of the social contract theory, and he's rejected it. And his answer is, well, I'm not a mushroom. I'm paraphrasing the quotation, but essentially he's saying like this idea of like you're just an individual with individual sovereignty is just stupid, because you are born as somebody's son into somebody's bloodline, into somebody's family, and there are certain duties and responsibilities in that regard, and your father has sovereignty over you, right? So he rejected the social contract. Filmer believes in the patriarchy. Filmer believes in absolute monarchy, and he believes essentially that the king has the right to rule over the people because the king is the father of the nation. And he raises many, many different arguments in the book, but the central argument, as far as I can understand it, is that in the same way that the father has absolute authority over the children, the king should have absolute authority over the nation, and that goes as far as being able to execute your children and thus being able to execute your subjects. So essentially, at the core of he presents many, many arguments, but at the core of it, he says that the father has the right of life and death over the son. And he says this is evident in the Bible, in various different stories. To be honest with you, I'm just not really that interested in Bible study, so I didn't memorize all that part of it. But I mean, we could look at Abraham, God. But then again, you could say, well, it's God that told Abraham to sacrifice his son. So, okay, I mean, there's that. But it's in the Bible, and it's also in Roman law. Cassius is the example that he cites. So essentially Rome goes through three phases. As we know, we have the Kingdom of Rome, and then we have the Republic, and then we have the Roman Empire. So during the Roman Republic, you have the I forget what it's called off the top of my head, but the long period of struggle. Okay, because first of all, you essentially of the plebs versus the patricians. So it's like the House of Lords versus the House of Commons, right? The plebs are the commoners, and the patricians are the lords, right? Or the aristocracy, or whatever you want to call it. Long struggle of power, but there's one character who wants to give away a lot of the land to the plebs, and he ends up being executed by his father, Cassius, who throws him off the... There's a rock in Rome where they throw the traitors off to execute them if they disobey, or if they betray Rome. So he kills him. He kills his son. And his son is a grown man. But nobody bats an eyelid. Nobody says that it's an injustice. Because in old Rome, it was considered right for a father to kill his son if he desired to do so. So Filmer takes this. He believes that the father has the right of life and death over the son. He doesn't really, as far as I saw it, like fully expand on this idea. I mean, if I was going to expand in it, I'd say it's because the father gave life to the son, right? It's the right of the seed, the semen, or something like this. He doesn't really expand on it. He just says this is the way it is. This is the way it is in the Bible. This is the way it is or was in ancient times. And so he says that the king is playing the role of the father of the nation, and thus he has the right of life and death, and thus he has the right to make all the rules and the laws up, and he can essentially do whatever he wants, right? So... again, when it comes to books like this, philosophical books in general, I mean, take everything I say here with a pinch of salt. Like, if you want to really understand the book, like, read it yourself. Right? That's always going to be my advice. This book in itself is only it's not even really a book. It's like 60 pages long. So there you go. It's quite accessible. I'm just saying that because when it comes to making these short little videos, essentially, as you know, my idea is read a book, make a video about the book. Read a book, video, book, video, book, video. Like, that's the path of knowledge that I'm following. That's what fires me up. That's what I enjoy. It stimulates my mind. It makes me hungry to read more, because then I feel like, oh, read this, and then what am I going to say about it? And, it excites me, right? It stimulates me. So essentially the book in itself, I'm using all of these books just as an excuse to talk about something, as Bowden said, a totem pole, right? I'm talking around the Patriarcha. I'm not really giving a detailed analysis of the Patriarcha. If I wanted to do that, I'd have to sit down with a pen and paper and mark out each individual argument, and then take detailed notes and say what he said and what he didn't say, and these are the arguments for and against, and blah, 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 blah. And I'm not going to do that because that's a lot of hard work and I can't be bothered. Okay, so I have to give this disclaimer because, if I'm talking about Animal Farm, it's all right. I can just ramble on about whatever. If I'm talking about Neuromancer, I can ramble on. If I'm talking about a serious piece of philosophical history, then I have to just give you an explanation that maybe I didn't fully understand what Filmer says, or whatever. If you want to really know what he says, read his book. It's basically what I'm trying to say. I'm giving a disclaimer to you. But anyway, my understanding is that that's his central argument. Okay, essentially he says that in the beginning, the first kings were the fathers. Okay, in biblical times, the descendants of Adam. A lot of this, like a lot of political theory at this time, is rooted in the Bible. Thomas Hobbes's Leviathan was rooted in the Bible. A lot of people call Hobbes a atheists for some interesting reason, even though at least half of the Leviathan is various different quotations about the Bible, and this happens and that happens and what have you. So these are political ideas that have come out of the English Reformation, and the Reformation, of course, was essentially a turning. Well, the way the Catholics would phrase it anyway, it was a turning away from the New Testament to the Old Testament, because they rejected the teachings of the Pope, and so they rejected all of the, built up orthodoxy of the Catholic Church, and they said, no, we're going to read the Bible and take our lessons from that. This is why Catholics will say it's a Judaizing of Christianity, because of course, the Protestants would disagree. They say, no, we're following the New Testament, but they are going back to the Bible. They're going back to what the Jews did in the Old Testament and looking at, taking examples from that and looking for guidance from those people, which isn't really what the Catholic Church was all about. So the book is full of references to the Bible, and he talks about Adam, and he says that the first king was Adam, basically, as being the first man, and Adam was the father of mankind, and so he had authority over his children. And then he said, well, what you had is with these different family groups, these different patriarchs, and they would have their children, and they would rule over their children, essentially, and then this spread out across the world. And then we don't know who the direct descendant of Adam is anymore, but nonetheless, this is the system that we have inherited. The first kings of the world were the fathers of small clans, and that is where the principle of the king was established. That is how it evolved. That is how it appeared, and this is how it has been continued. This is what has come down to us, and so we should continue in this regard. Right, and those fathers had full authority of life and death over their children, and so we should continue like that. That's essentially more or less like the core of his argument. He does raise a whole bunch of other arguments. There's a lot of good points. I'm not trying to totally dismiss Robert Filmer, because obviously I don't accept his conclusion. I do believe in a constitutional monarchy, and I do believe in a social contract, and I do believe in a parliament. But nonetheless, he does raise a lot of good criticisms of democracy and a lot of good points in favour of the monarchy. He talks about the duplicity of the people, how mob rule can... people are very fickle, and they'll go after people and tear people down. What's her name? Lucy Letby would be an example of this. She got witch hunted, isn't it? It's like, blame the white girl for killing those children. She's so evil. It's like, what are you talking about? Some children died, and it looks like the NHS wants to blame it on the white woman. Right? That's what it looks like to me. And now the anger's passed. It's been a year or so since that story came out, and now people are starting to scratch their heads and think, wow, yeah, this... And they're starting to look at the court case and so on and so forth. So he talks about how fickle people in general are, and thus they shouldn't be allowed to have a democracy. In response to this, I would say generally, like, when there is obviously a truth to this, but usually the mob wants to tear a single person down, or maybe an institution that's represented by a single person. I would argue that if we had genuine mob rule in this country, we would have closed the border a long time ago. If we had rule by referendum, then this country would be a much, much better place. I would argue that Switzerland is probably one of the greatest countries in the world, and that has rule by referendum. And the people of Switzerland have a lot of faith in their government. They're happy with their government. It's one of the most successful governments in the world, like 80% approval rating or something like this, because they can veto what the government does, and they feel like the government cares about them, and they feel like they have a say and they're being listened to. So is Switzerland mob rule? Well, no. There are checks and balances, but I mean, I think the mob's instinct is actually quite conservative in a way. If you allow genuine mob rule, it will swing to the right eventually. Like if we had mob rule now, it would be left wing for a while, but it would swing back to the right. And I say this because I just think in general, if you have freedom of speech, theoretically, if you've got a mob, you've got sort of freedom of speech, haven't you? I mean, if people are angry on the streets, they're saying whatever they want. If you have freedom of speech and you have large groups of people rampaging, then the truth will come out because they'll just say it, right? This is why if you have a social media platform like 4chan, which is essentially an example of a sort of mob rule, it swings to the right because silly stuff like transgenderism just isn't tolerated. And they'll point out things like the Jewish question and what have you. So I don't know. I mean, but I do see Filmer's point. The mob can be duplicitous. He talks about how a king, generally, if you have a tyrant, he won't persecute the people as a whole. He'll persecute some various individuals that have upset him. I think he's actually quite right in this regard. Even when it comes to somebody utterly horrible like Nero. Now, of course, in the 20th century, that's different because you had socialist dictatorships. And so Stalin obviously horrifically terrorized the people, as did Mao, as did Pol Pot. But that is because they had a specific kind of ideology that they were imposing on the people. You could argue Islamic, sultans and what have you, when they conquer a country, they would also terrorize the people. So, but I do think generally, like a tyrant, I think he does have a point that a tyrant generally, like, he'll have his favorites and he'll have some people that in the country that he doesn't like, and so he'll persecute them, but it's not really in his interests to harm the people as a whole, right? And that's another argument in favor of the king, that the king is tied to the land. It is his estate, and it is in his interests for that estate to be wealthy, so that he can gather money, so that he can gather an army, so that he can defend himself. And in order for the nation to be wealthy, it's good for the nation to be just and to be fair, and to have fair laws that are passed, and to so that wealth can be generated. Because if you have too much corruption and thievery and so on and so forth, then the nation's not going to be wealthy. If your nation's not wealthy, you're going to get conquered. And I think he's absolutely right about this. Politicians come and go. They get into a position of power. They milk as much money as they can out of the state, and then they disappear. The king is there for life. He has a reputation to maintain, and he has a reputation that he has to pass on to his children. So it's a very good argument in favour of monarchy. In a similar vein, Filmer points out how much corruption there is in democracy because of bribery and so on and so forth, whereas it's very difficult to bribe the king, isn't it? Because he's already got everything. So what are you going to bribe him with? So he presents a whole series of arguments in favour of the monarchy, but the key idea here is the father has absolute power of life and death over the son. I don't agree with this. I don't think it's okay for parents to kill their children. Is that a radical thing for me to say? I don't know, but I don't really. Oh man, I mean, I guess it's a question that a lot of people are discussing abortion now, and maybe I'm contradicting myself. I was arguing on the stream recently. Well, we've been talking about abortion a lot. I'm in favour of abortion up to the quickening. The quickening is when the baby starts to kick. Okay, and so when the baby kicks, it's conscious, and so if you haven't aborted it already, then you should wait till it's born, right? You should allow it to take birth. But I've also been arguing that if you give birth to a cripple, you should throw it in the river. Like, there's no point looking after a child that's got like 4 arms or whatever. It's just like spasticated and messed up. What are you going to do? You're going to spend your whole life looking after that? So I would argue for euthanizing, terminating, for want of a better word, children like that. And people might say that's horribly barbaric to say so. Well, you're not the one that has to raise that kid and spend your whole life, pushing it around in a wheelchair. Okay, that's the first point. And it's really just a rich man's luxury to look after a crippled child, or the luxury of a rich nation to look after people like that. If you're a poor nation and you're struggling, to find food, and maybe you're worried about getting invaded by another country or what have you, like, do you want that crippled kid dragging you down? So I suppose when it comes to giving birth to crippled children, yeah, I'd throw it in the river. I think you get a choice when it takes birth. I would also argue, this is a point that Filmer makes, that there is no nation in the world which interferes, like, with the raising of children, or interferes with a father's authority over his children. But it's very interesting because in the modern age we do have, obviously, a lot of interference by the state in the raising of children. You have to send your kids to school. If you don't, somebody will come round to your house, or maybe they'll accuse you of this, accuse you of that, take your children away. You've got obviously the transgenderism issue. I mean, this is related to divorce. So the wife will take the children and then turn the boy into a girl, castrate the boy, essentially. It's never used to be the case, by the way. It used to be the case that the father would own the children, and if they got a divorce, the woman would go off and he'd keep the kids. This changed somewhere in the 19th century. So you have all kinds of incidents like this where parents' authority is challenged in the modern age. I think it's awful. And I would the real like difficult question to ask here is, well, what about child abuse? What about sexual abuse or other physical abuse? Shouldn't children be protected? And my answer to that quite horrific question is that, well, how do you prove it? How do you prove it? If it's a young child, unless the child's coming to school and it's got like covered in bruises and this kind of thing, how are you going to prove that it's really being abused? Or especially when it comes to sexual abuse, like how do you prove this? So if you're giving the government the power to take people's children away, then I think a lot of the time the path to hell is paved with good intentions, and essentially you just end up with tyrannical human resources type middle-aged women destroying working class families because they think they're a bit racist or whatever, right? Oh, I'm going to take your kids away from... And you have parents living in fear of the state, living in fear that the state's going to take their children away. So I mean, this is the thing you have to consider when you're talking about the law. How enforceable is the law, and how much power do you want to give to the state? So it's a horrific thing to say, but man, yes, it's a tough one, and I'm dubious about going on the internet and defending child abuse. But I don't think the state should have the power to intervene, basically, because it's so difficult to prove, right? I mean, another subject matter that's sprung up recently is this whole suicide question. It's like, okay, a lot of people are asking to give people the right to kill their relatives because they're suffering and that. Okay, I mean, I understand. You got a relative, they got fucking cancer or whatever, and they're like they're in pain. You want to just like knock them off. Fine, give them the sleeping pills or whatever, and knock them off. Who's gonna know that you did it? Nobody. So, but if you give the government the ability to kill these people and make it legal, now all of a sudden you end up with like a Canada type situation where they are killing 10,000 people a year. Okay, so it's like a slippery slope. It's like you think you're trying to do something good, right? Euthanizing sick people. You end up with 10,000 dead people a year killed by the Canadian government, right? And the Canadian government offering poor people like, oh, you're poor? Maybe have you considered suicide, right? And in the same way, you think you're doing something good, trying to protect children from child abuse, which I think, by the way, is very, very rare. Like real, genuine, nasty child abuse. Like proper hard beating and like torture or whatever and sexual abuse. I think it's a very, very rare thing to happen. Because it's just it's so against the nature of a parent to do something like that. But you think you're trying to do something good to protect these children, and then you end up giving the government the power to take people's kids away. And then innocent people have their families broken up, and now so many families just live in fear of the state, right? Oh, I said something racist, and so now the government's going to take my kids away, or it just morphs and it turns into, the government has the right to educate your children and do what it wants with your children. So your children will go to school and they will be turned into homosexuals at school because the government all of a sudden has a right over your children. So I side with Filmer. In regard to the children. I think parents just do have a de facto power of life and death over their kids. Because if a parent wants to kill a child, its child, like how they can do it and they can get away with it. I mean, all you got to do is put a pillow over somebody's face so they can't breathe, and then it's just like, oh wow, they're dead. I don't. What happened? Who's gonna know? Who's gonna know? So obviously, I'm not in favor of parents killing their children, right? But I'm just saying, like, evil people are going to do evil things, and there's not really much you can do about it. If you try and prevent things from that from happening, then you just end up hurting a lot of innocent people, right? So I think Filmer is right in that parents do have a de facto power of life and death over their children simply because they're physically larger and stronger. But my argument would be that when the child grows up and it becomes an adult, you don't have that right anymore. And this is where Filmer's whole argument of the right of the king and the power of the king just totally falls to pieces. I just do not think that I don't think the king can have absolute power. It doesn't make sense because there's always going to be some kind of middle ground between what the king or the father tells you to do and what the son or the citizen or the subject is going to do. Even if you live in a country where there is no rule of law and it is recognized by law that the king is above the law and he can do whatever he wants, right? He can make the laws, he can break the laws, he can change the laws. He is free to do whatever he wants. Even if such a country existed, there is always still going to be a limit to the king's power. Because what if the king tells people to do something totally absurd and stupid? Like it tells all the men to have gay sex with each other, or tells all marriages are broken now and people are free, or tells people they have to castrate themselves, or whatever, some crazy idea, right? Like at some point the people are going to say no, and they're going to push back in some way, and the king will have to surrender. The king will have to say, oh, okay. I mean, he could just start killing people left, right and center. I mean, this is what Stalin did, and maybe he'll get away with it for his whole life, right? And we'll have to wait till he dies. But I mean, eventually the tyranny will collapse because people don't like getting pushed around. They can't tolerate it for a long length of time. It's just the nature of people not to enjoy being pushed around. In the same way, a father can beat his son and order him around and say, do this and do that. He can be a real mean father. But at some point in time, the son's going to turn around. He's either going to leave home, which is one option, or he's just going to turn around and he's going to punch his father in the face or murder him. right? Oh, look, my dad's dead. Oh, I've inherited the land, you know. Um, so I guess my argument is might is right at the end of the day. Might is right. The king has absolute authority in as much as he has absolute might. And nobody has absolute might. And so everybody has to compromise to a certain extent. And so essentially, my argument would be that the parliament is like the compromise. It's the halfway point. In a constitutional monarchy, it's the halfway point between the might of the king and the might of the people. Right? The might of the father and the might of the son. And this is just the way the world works. There's no father that has absolute authority over his family. There's always a bartering. There's always a back and forth, a to and fro. And Parliament is the legitimized, institutionalized manifestation of that to and fro. And I think it's fair, and I think it's good, and I think it's stable, and I think it's the best form of government in the world. Because you get the stability of the monarchy plus a voice for the people to complain about stuff, essentially. And it works very well. And then people these days will say, well, it's totally broken. Oh, the parliamentary system is corrupt and blah, blah, blah. Yeah, it is. But, I mean, we've just managed to elect reform. They're in parliament now. And they're kicking ass. And the whole system is just totally transforming. I mean, it took a long time. It took 20 years, 25 years, or whatever, however you want to count it. It took a long time for the change to manifest. But it has manifested. And change is upon us. Right? They kicked out Trump, but Trump came back. They tried to crush the MAGA movement, but the people spoke and they said, no, we want MAGA. So the people do have power, and populism has power, and ideas have power, and the authority of the state is not absolute, especially in a modern age like ours, which is built on the principles of liberty, the idea of liberty. People in this country like to believe that they are free. Okay, Stalin got away with being a psychopathic dictator because he told the people of the Soviet Union that dictatorship was good and that a totalitarian government was good, and they accepted it and they swallowed it, and thus by doing that they essentially consented to being ruthlessly pushed around until they got fed up with that crazy system and they tore it all down. But in our system, we have a belief in liberty and freedom of speech in the background. So for how long can woke culture exist in such an environment? And this is not something I'm just saying now. I've said this 2, 3, 4 years ago. This is why I've always been slightly hopeful and positive about the situation. There are a lot of people out there just say, oh, democracy is rubbish, democracy is rubbish. Well, do you want to live in the Soviet Union? Do you want that? Do you want to live in North Korea? Do you really think that's a good idea? I don't think so. One of the beauties of democracy is that there is a background belief in liberty and freedom of speech. And if you have that in everybody's mind, whether or not it's enshrined in law or not, the people are always going to continually rebel in favor of liberty. Right? Even if they don't know anything about the law or the history or whatever, they're just going to be sitting there thinking, well, I live in a free country. Why can't I do this or do that or say this or say that? And they'll kick up a fuss if you try and push them around. So it's just difficult for the elites of this world to impose any kind of totalitarian system on people that think that they're free. Right? I mean, they can manipulate them in other ways. Mass immigration is the best way. Filling the television with pornography and homosexuality and transgenderism and all the rest of it is another great way of just nudging people into stupidity and degeneracy and obviously manipulating the economy. I mean, there are other ways. But if people believe that they are free and they live in a free country, then they're going to continually rebel against these things. So I think the system works. I think the belief in liberty is a good thing. My opinion, as I've stated many times before, is that I believe in England. I'm English, and I believe that the English are the descendants of the Anglo-Saxons, and we all came from Denmark in the beginning, and the ancient Germans, the ancient Germanic people, the Germanic pagans, they had a form of democracy. This form of democracy was known as the Thing, and the people would get together and they would vote on, there would be a council, there would be a meeting. The warriors would gather and vote on things and judge things, and etc., etc., etc. The people of the ancient pagan Anglo-Saxon Germanic culture had some kind of vote. And this word, the Thing, has been enshrined in our language as a husting. A husting is a house thing, right? We all know hustings. It's like a voting system in politics. You raise your hand or whatever. So Filmer doesn't talk about this. Hobbes doesn't talk about this. John Locke doesn't talk about this. Rousseau does not talk about this. I don't think any of the Enlightenment authors traced the history of democracy really back to Germanic paganism. Not that I have seen. They do talk about the Witan, which is the parliament that we had before William the Bastard came over. So there is some kind of myth of, I don't think it's a myth, I think it's true actually. I think there is the idea of the Anglo-Saxon liberty that we lost, and I think the history of the English people has essentially been a long ongoing rebellion to gain our liberties back that we lost since William the Bastard came over and brought the tax collectors with him. So there is a lot to be said about the Anglo-Saxon culture, but because all of these writers were Christians, they would not go far enough, and they wouldn't trace it all the way back to Woden and Odin and Germanic paganism and the Thing, right? Not that I've seen. You don't get that vibe. Instead, they look to Rome. They look to Athens and they look to Rome. I mean, in this book, Filmer himself, he talks about both of these democratic states, and he talks about the Bible. He doesn't talk about the Germanic people at all. So, I mean, there's a lot of political history which is just separated from who we are, essentially. We as a race are just separated from our ancestors. This is why we got in such a muddle in the first place. It's like we, the English, it's like we're like half Roman, half Jewish because of the Old Testament, and we sort of know that we're Anglo-Saxon, but it's not really celebrated. That part of our history has not been thoroughly brought out, I think that in order to save us, I think if you are a genuine ethno-nationalist, you should say, okay, I'm an ethno-nationalist. What is the anthropology of the English race? How did we used to behave in ancient times before all this technology and political changes and so on and so forth? How did our ancestors behave? Well, they voted. They believed in democracy. They wouldn't call it democracy, but they believed in some form of representation. And they believed in some form of liberty. So that's what comes very naturally to us. That's what we desire. That's what we crave. It's fascinating for me to see so many ethno-nationalists on the internet with their runes and their picture of Thor and what have you, and talking about the Vikings, and at the same time they're talking about all this, they're calling for some kind of tyrannical system. I just don't think that those people were tyrannical at all. They were warriors and they had a heroic culture, and the kings of old would hold court and they would sit in their halls, and if they were fair and they were just, people would follow them, and if they weren't, people would leave, and as I say, they would have a thing and people would have a voice. So it's strange for me to see so many ethno-nationalists advocate for fascism. Fascism itself is the idea, the concept of the dictator, I think Mussolini got it from Karl Marx. Obviously, he talked about the dictatorship of the proletariat, but Marx himself got it from the Romans, because the dictator was the guy that stepped in when the Republic was in danger and they needed an absolute authority in order to defeat the enemy, right? So the idea, but this was a temporary thing. You'd have the absolute dictator and then you return to the Republic. Cincinnati is the best example of this. He was a farmer, they brought him in, he fought the enemy, he won, he went back to farming. And everyone said, oh, you're a great guy. That's why they built a city named after him in America. So the idea of a dictator for life is just repugnant. It's nonsensical. It's stupid. It's not how the Romans did it. I don't think it was even Karl Marx's intention. I mean, the idea was a dictatorship of the proletariat, which will then transform into the communist utopia. Not that you're Stalin and you're a dictator for the rest of your life and you just throw everybody in the flipping gulag. So anyway, there's the whole, there's too many people on the internet screaming that they want some kind of hyper-authoritarian government. No, that's retarded. Don't listen to it. Don't fall for it. Your ancestors believed in liberty. Please don't fall for it, right? It is interesting, though, that those same types of people that call for all that, they won't talk about Filmer at all because they don't do their homework and they don't do their reading. Everybody makes fun of Sargon of Akkad because he famously once said, have you even read John Locke, right? I don't even know. I mean, that was like 8 years ago. I don't even know if people still remember the joke. But they made fun of him, but he was right. Like, if you want to talk politics, you should read the political history of your country. Don't just read Evola and Mein Kampf and think that you understand everything. You absolute moron. But if they did read John Locke, maybe they would have read Filmer, because we have one of the most radical books in favour of absolute monarchy, and it's written in the English language, and I don't see anybody talking about it because nobody reads, nobody does their homework. But anyway, whatever. It's a good book, okay? It's a good book. I recommend it. Many arguments in favour of the king. I've stated some already. I mean, there are others. I would argue, that if you have a king, the king is it's family friendly. These are like modern age arguments for the king. This is not what Filmer said, but I'm saying the king is family friendly. Like, the king will have a queen and they will have children. The king is not going to be gay because gay people don't have kids, and one of the important things on the father's mind is how he's going to pass the estate on to, essentially. So the king is always going to be naturally conservative. He's always going to swing in that direction. He's going to be family friendly. He's going to appeal to the family type, family orientated people of the nation. He's going to appeal to the women of the nation. They're going to like to look at Kate Middleton. Or what's she wearing? What's her dress? How does she dress her children? Oh, aren't the kids cute? Oh, this is good for the soul of the nation. This makes people happy, and it doesn't cost much. The monarchy does not cost. I don't know how much it costs. Like 100 million a year to run it, or something like this. Probably less. I don't know. The NHS costs 200 billion. It's an insanely stupid amount of money. We're spending 5 billion on asylum seekers. We spend more money on asylum seekers than we spend on the monarchy in this country. I mean, get that straight, right? And yet they're calling to abolish it, right? Because, it's such a waste of money. It's just absurd. It's utterly retarded. But it's family friendly. You're putting a family at the centre of your country, and thus you're putting family values at the centre of your country. The monarchy will automatically, in a natural way, it's going to uphold the traditions of the country by going to the Christmas celebration and Remembrance Sunday and various different festivities throughout the year. They're going to take part in these things, and people will come together, and etc., etc. Even if it's just silly stuff like watching Wimbledon or going to the Grand National or whatever, they're still going to do these things which is good for the nation because traditions are good for the nation because it keeps the ball rolling. It gives you something higher and something older and something better than just trashy Hollywood culture or whatever, right? Whatever the latest thing is that they're trying to sell you on the TV. It gives some permanence. It gives a sense of tradition and history to the nation. It's good for advertising. A lot of people make fun of this. Oh, how many people actually visit Buckingham Palace? What do you mean the king's good for advertising? No, do you know how many people watched the coronation? Like literally 1 billion, right? Or how many people watched William and Kate get married? Like, it was a lot, you know? And so when people think of England, they think of the king and they think of the royal family. These people are very, very famous. And that makes them think of England, and therefore they're more likely to come here or buy things from England or whatever. It's a soft power. If they think, how many people are thinking of Poland? How many people are thinking of, I don't know, Mozambique? Right? No one. Because they're not famous. We have great fame in this country, and part of that is because of our monarchy. But how do you calculate that in financial terms? It's impossible to calculate, but it should be obvious. And yet many people can't see it. So you have all of this. You also just have a calming effect on the nation in that even in times of great political turmoil, like the recent Brexit palaver that was raging throughout Parliament for several years, you know that the monarchy is there in the background, right? So we're not going to have a dictatorship. We're not going to, things aren't going to spiral out of control. The army's not going to rebel, right? Whereas, like we just saw recently in South Korea, the president, he's like, martial law. And the army kind of started to follow his orders, but not really. They kind of half-hearted followed it, and then it all collapsed, and now apparently he's going to jail or whatever. But anyway, I mean, he came close, right? Could have gone really badly. Could have gone in totally a different direction. That is very unlikely to happen in a constitutional monarchy like ours, because of the calming nature of the king. The army serves the king. The army does not serve the prime minister. And and you may think, well, that's just a formality. Well, I don't know. I mean, the soldiers of this country, they swear an oath to the king, right? What's going to happen if the prime minister tells them to execute the king or something like this? You know, they're just going to say, well, no. They're not going to do it. It really will make a prime minister think twice about how powerful he is. So it has a calming effect on the nation. Of course, my feeling about King Charles is just that he's too weak. He has this incredible soft power and he's not using it. He is woke King Charles. People say, oh, what could he do? Well, all he has to do is come out and say, for example, I don't think men should be going in women's toilets. Boom. One statement. He doesn't have to go to Parliament and try and fire Keir Starmer or anything, but he could just make some statements here and there, some conservative statements here and there, and this would massively, fundamentally influence public opinion. Like, the king has this soft power, even though he's maybe legally, I mean, it's arguable whether he legally has the power to do anything or not, like shut down Parliament or not. I mean, I don't know. But he has this massive, massive soft power. If our king wanted to, he could crush the woke. I mean, it looks like the woke's dead now anyway, fortunately, because Trump got elected again. But the king had a massive opportunity there to crush the woke. He could have just made a few statements about mass immigration, about the transgender thing, about Brexit, etc., some basic kind of, nothing radical, just some basic right-wing talking points. And he could have crushed the woke, and he would have been a hero. He would have gone down in history as a great king. Instead, he's going down in history as a wimp and a coward. So I think that our constitutional monarchy is good, but one of the problems that we have with it is that the king has essentially psyop from birth. He's surrounded by bad advisors from birth. and they've kind of brainwashed him, and he doesn't realize that he has the power that he has, and he needs. I've talked about this several times before, but it really is a case of, it's like the Republicans going after the black vote, right? It's like, or the Tories going after the left-wing vote. It's like they think, oh, well, we've got the gammon in our pocket, we've got the average right-wing Brit in our pocket, so let's try and get those left-wing people over there as well. So they take their support for granted. King Charles takes the support of the, church-going, British Empire loving gammon for granted, and instead he's going off to Davos and trying to get the approval of homosexuals and globalists and so on and so forth. He's not defending his own people, his own side. He doesn't protect them, and as I say, he doesn't have to do anything. He just has to say a few words here and there, which would utterly transform the political landscape, but he doesn't do it. And it's cowardly of him, and it's weak of him. And it's why so many people are just getting totally fed up with the monarchy. But nonetheless, better to have it than not to. Hopefully, my hope moving forwards is that King George turns out to be a better man than his father and his grandfather. And we essentially just need a king that's more involved in public life, or more politically involved, not just going to charities and here and there. But he should do interviews, and he should talk to journalists and talk over the issues of the day. People would watch it, and they would feel like there's somebody at the top who actually cares about them, and then they can communicate with them, and there's a back and forth. That should be his role. He should exercise his soft power, and then the nation would be much more conservative because of it. Because the king is a natural conservative. He always has been, always will be. It's just he's isolated himself. There's a massive waste. It's a massive wasted opportunity. But anyway, I could ramble on and on. There's so many points in this book. Good book. Robert Filmer, Patriarcha. I think he's right about the idea that the power of the king is rooted in the father. I just don't believe in the absolute authority of the father over a grown adult man, because the man can fight back. Okay, so even if theoretically by law he has the power, the son can always just chop his father's head off. In the same way, even if theoretically by law you say the king has absolute power, the people can riot. So it doesn't really mean anything. At the end of the day, might is right. So this has to be taken into account. And so the king, a sensible king, should say, well, I should give a voice to the people. I should give them some form of parliament, some form of democracy. And then we can meet halfway and everybody's happy. Whether we're talking universal suffrage or universal male suffrage or just a House of Lords or however it's going to work. The mob, the people need a voice. That just is what it is. I don't think Robert Filmer grasps it. I also think he doesn't there's no sense of duty in this book. I think that Confucius had. I've not read I think it's Analytics, isn't it? Confucius's book. But from what I've heard, Confucius, the Chinese philosopher, put a lot of emphasis on the filial duty, like you have to serve your parents. I don't see any of that in this book. It's very strange. I don't see him saying, a son owes his father this and owes his king this. No, it's very one-sided. He's just like, no, you have to obey the king. That's it. It's like, okay, mate. What if I don't want to? So things are a bit one-sided. And I think he's right when he says, at the end of the day, human judgment is always superior to the law. The law is only ever a guideline. You're going to have to judge whether that law is applied or not. And I think that at the end of the day, essentially the king sort of is above the law, technically speaking. Because technically speaking, man himself is above the law in a sense, because somebody has to apply the law and somebody has to judge how that law is going to be interpreted in different circumstances. So he's right about this. The king, technically speaking, really is above the law. And you also do need a final judge. You need, like, otherwise you just have this infinite regress of, like, you know, if you're living in a republic, oh, the Supreme Court said this, the president said that, the senator over there said this, and it just goes back and forth. This is why you look at American politics, they're just obsessed with law. It's all about lawyers just going back and forth, and it's just endless. You need a final judgment. You need somebody that's sitting there, even if he doesn't pass judgment, even if he's like our king and he just sits in the background not really doing very much. Everybody knows he's there. So if you get an emergency, he can step in. So Film is right about this. I mean, Film is also right that, when push comes to shove, you will revert to a dictatorship. In times of war, you need somebody of absolute power who can say, do this, do that, and who's prepared to make great sacrifices. I mean, this is one of the reasons why Stalin, again, a monster, an evil psychopathic monster, but nonetheless, he beat Hitler. And Hitler wanted to genocide the Slavic people. So is he a monster or is he a hero? Well, he's kind of both. This is why the Russians have the attitude that they have towards him, of just, they don't want to apologize for him. They don't want to tear him down. But at the same time, they will publish Solzhenitsyn and have that book published in school, the Gulag Archipelago. They will speak about his crimes. They'll do both at the same time. Kind of like Ivan the Terrible, right? And I think that's the right attitude to have. That's the attitude I have towards Churchill. People just don't grasp it for some reason. Can you imagine, though, if the Russians started apologizing for Stalin? Because Stalin inflicted a great amount of harm on Poland and other Eastern European countries. Well, they'd all be screaming at the Russians, oh, this monster Stalin, he did this to us, he did that to us, and they'd all be complaining, and then the Russians would be apologizing, oh, we're sorry, I'm ashamed to be Russian, I'm sorry I'm Russian because of Stalin, and no, they're not going to fall for that trap. They're not going to fall for the trap the Germans have fallen for, or the trap our country has sort of fallen for in regard to Churchill, depends what circles you're moving in. They're not going to fall for that trap. They are not going to apologize for Stalin because they know that other nations will use that to push them down. I don't know why British nationalists can't understand this in regard to Churchill. I guess they're not as smart as they think they are. But yeah, I mean, there you go. A lot of great points. A lot of great points raised by Robert Filmer. The patriarchy. I believe in the patriarchy, of course. I believe in the rule of men, and I believe in the king as a masculine force, and he should be there. But you need some kind of pushback. The people need a voice, and the son needs a voice, and the idea that a king can have absolute power is just wrong. It doesn't work. Perhaps in the short term, but not in the long term. And so you're always going to have to figure out a middle balance, and I think we got a good middle balance in our country. I really do. I mean, I'm not happy with. Obviously, since Blair came in, everything's just been since the Second World War, really. I mean, everything's just been garbage, but we can turn it around, and we will turn it around. And there you go. All right. Well, anyway, thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.